It all started with a phone call and a private jet. It was 1982. The North American home video game industry had just racked up $3.2 billion in sales. Arcade machines and consoles were the hottest business in the country. Atari, the company that had put the legendary 2600 into millions of homes, reigned without question. But in its offices, someone made a decision that would light the fuse on the biggest commercial disaster in its history. They took a 25-year-old man on a Learjet to the home of Steven Spielberg, the most famous director of the moment. They sent him back with an impossible assignment: turn the most beloved movie on the planet into a video game ready for the holiday season. Only 5 weeks, not a day more. The clock was already ticking, and the factory machines had not yet been turned on. The entire plan depended on a single man. That man's name was Howard Scott Warshaw. He was Atari's star programmer. He flew to Hollywood, met with Spielberg, and secured the rights to E.T., the extraterrestrial. But what he didn't get, what nobody at Atari imagined, was a sense of the scale of the catastrophe they were about to unleash. The deadline was a sentence: 5 weeks to design, program, and manufacture a cartridge that normally required months. Warshaw designed a game that respected the spirit of the film: collect pieces of an interplanetary phone so the alien could call home. The idea was noble. The result, compressed into a reckless timeline, was something else entirely. The controls were confusing. The pits you could barely escape from became legendary, and players felt frustrated within minutes. Years later, specialized critics would call it convoluted, absurd, and boring. Some even called it the worst video game in history. But that winter, before the blow fell, the question hung in the air like a blade: would anyone buy it? On Christmas Day, 1982, the shop windows glowed with E.T.'s face. The toy store chains had bet big. Atari had shipped 4 million cartridges to retailers. The expectation was enormous. But what happened next, nobody had foreseen. The response came very quickly, and it was devastating. Of those 4 million, around 3.5 million were returned. 3.5 million. The return figures doubled any forecast. No product in the history of entertainment had ever suffered such a massive rejection in so little time. Nobody in the company had counted on such a unanimous rejection. The return of merchandise collapsed the shelves. Wholesalers stopped accepting orders. Distribution centers refused to take more shipments. They had nowhere to store them. Warehouses began to fill up with boxes nobody wanted. The impact was so severe that many stores drastically cut their video game orders. The movie was still a cultural phenomenon, but the cartridge was a commercial corpse. In Atari's warehouse in El Paso, Texas, returns piled up without remedy, block after block of useless plastic. And then, in 1983, the company made the most extreme decision in its history. A convoy of trucks left El Paso at nightfall. The operation was carried out with a secrecy that bordered on the absurd, a company that raked in billions hiding its failure like a criminal. In their trailers, over 700,000 unsold cartridges. Most of them were E.T., but copies of other games that had flopped were traveling along too. Atari, the company that had helped invent the home video game industry, was about to do something unheard of: make its own product disappear under tons of earth in a New Mexico landfill. The trucks arrived at the Alamogordo landfill. There, between layers of urban garbage, the cartridges were buried. Box after box, like someone hiding a body. The workers poured concrete over the cartridges to make sure no one could recover them. The video game that was supposed to be the star gift of Christmas became a secret buried on purpose. But that burial was not the cause of the collapse. It was its most eloquent portrait. Atari was already wounded before that Christmas. The home video game market was coming down from the highest peak of its short life. In 1982, revenues neared $3.2 billion. 3 years later, in 1985, that figure had plummeted to something unthinkable, barely 100 million. A 97% collapse. The money, quite simply, ceased to exist. Entire companies went bankrupt. Thousands of employees lost their jobs. What seemed like an indestructible empire was reduced to dust in less than 1,000 days. Atari went from employing 10,000 people to laying off most of them in a matter of weeks. It was a sudden death for an entire generation of companies. The following Christmas, children didn't find new consoles under the tree. Parents, wary from the experience, switched to computers, believing they would at least serve for something more than playing. What had happened? Later studies identified a lethal combination. Analysts compared the situation to a gold rush that ends in bankruptcy. First, a flood of low-quality titles. Promotional games like the Kool-Aid one filled the shelves. People bought them once and never came back. Second, consumer confidence evaporated. Families grew tired of spending money on mediocre cartridges that promised a lot and delivered little. And third, home computers dropped in price and offered something consoles didn't, a machine for working and for playing. The mix was explosive. The video game bubble burst without warning. In a matter of months, stores left their shelves empty or filled them with calculators and computer peripherals. Atari, which had grown at a dizzying pace over the previous decade, never financially recovered from the disaster. The E.T. game didn't just kill video games. It was the perfect example of the evil that was devouring them, the triumph of haste over quality, the inability to tell a good idea apart from a good business. The myth of the pit grew over the years. There were stories of millions of cartridges, of lost technological treasures. But no one had offered a single piece of evidence. For 3 decades, Alamogordo was an urban legend. Neighbors said the electronic waste buried beneath their feet had cost a fortune. Collectors dreamed of the day someone would bring it to light. Many doubted the burial had really taken place. In 2014, that day arrived. A team made up of documentary filmmakers, video game historians, and city officials from Alamogordo set up at the old landfill. They dug, and they found what was left, around 1,300 cartridges. Most of them, copies of E.T. the Extraterrestrial, their labels faded by time. The excavation team, led by Fuel Entertainment and supported by Microsoft for the documentary Atari Game Over, found not only E.T., but also copies of Raiders of the Lost Ark and other titles. It was the archaeology of excess, objects that had cost millions to manufacture, sleeping under the sand for more than 30 years. The news went around the world and the curious gathered to see the relics. Afterward, the recovered cartridges went up for auction. The entire operation raised a total of $108,000. Some individual cartridges sold for more than $1,500 each. What was once the symbol of the industry's greatest failure was now being sold as a coveted relic. Not even the ghosts of the market are immune to the law of supply and demand. But the real lesson wasn't in the price of those pieces of plastic. What the desert swallowed that night wasn't just 700,000 cartridges. It was the confidence of an entire industry. A confidence that, once lost, is buried much deeper than any cartridge. It took a new generation of Japanese companies like Nintendo to rewrite the rules. It took years to sprout again. And when it did, the rules of the game had changed forever.